Thank you so much for coming out to a lecture on a beautiful afternoon. I think this is actually a great moment to think about the environment as we get out of our winter coats and our houses and our offices to walk across campus and come here. Just a couple of general items before I introduce our speaker. This afternoon's lecture is part of our programming for our theme this academic year, Cultures of Green, Nature, and the Environment. And I want to thank those members of the seminar, the faculty-student seminar that's been meeting, and members of my class that are here, so thank you very much for coming. If you want to know more about this, please visit our website. Also, the Baker North Center is in the midst of a challenge grant. We've been awarded a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, but it requires us to raise matching funds, and one way we're doing this is by forming a friends group, and our motto is, we cannot have too many friends. So if you'd like to find out more, we have brochures on the front table about becoming a friend and helping to support programs such as the one you're about to hear. Also, an important reminder, don't forget to silence your cell phones, if you could, please. So we're delighted that this afternoon's speaker, John Soluri, was willing to leave his family, colleagues, and students at Carnegie Mellon University to spend a few days with us. And it's been a pleasure to have him here. He's been meeting with faculty and students all day, so I'm glad you still have energy left. Dr. Soluri is an environmental historian and a historian of Latin America, whose work also engages with commodities and the processes of commodification. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan and established a scholarly reputation with the book Banana Cultures, Agriculture, Consumption, and Environmental Change in Honduras and the United States, which won the George Perkins Marsh Award for Best Book in Environmental History, awarded by the American Society for Environmental History. He has numerous articles to his credit, and in particular, I recommend History's Freaks of Nature, which appeared in Environmental History in 2005. Today, Dr. Soluri is going to introduce us to his new project, which extends his analysis from agriculture to aquaculture in Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Soluri. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everybody. Thanks, Anne. Also, I want to thank, just before I forget, Maggie Kaminsky, Linda Gilmore. I'm sure there's probably a couple other people who have helped make the talk possible, everybody who's been willing to have dinner, lunch with me, help print out my talk, all that kind of stuff. I'm deeply appreciative, and of course to everybody who came here for the talk. I know it is a beautiful day, and I do appreciate it. And just since these opportunities don't come up a lot, I'm going to take this sort of public moment to thank Ted Steinberg, who once upon a time in a galaxy not too far away encouraged me to become an environmental historian. So thanks, Ted. It's not been a bad gig so far, so appreciate the advice. Okay, and before I get started though, let me just get a sense. How many of you here are undergraduate students? If you don't mind putting your hand up, just want to get, okay. How many guys are graduate students? How many people are faculty, staff, adults, full-fledged adults? Okay, great, thank you. How many people here eat salmon, have eaten salmon? Just to get a sense of, okay. All right, excellent. I've got three primary objectives I want to do with this talk, which the title is something fishy, Blue Revolutions, Sustainability, Environmental History. My objectives are the following. One, I'm going to do what historians tend to like to do, which is tell a story about the recent history of aquaculture, let's say fish farming in southern Chile, in order to answer a question posed by my uncle, who apparently has an above average knowledge of geography for a North American, and he asked me, I think it was over Thanksgiving, he said, why do I see Atlantic salmon from Chile in my supermarket? And I was like, good question, Uncle Barry, why is that? So I'm going to try to answer that question. Secondly, I want to demonstrate the ways, and maybe more difficultly, that analytical power of comparative environmental history can challenge the ways that people approach sustainability, the idea of sustainability, and perhaps the practices too. And finally, and perhaps of greatest interest to this group, or at least a subset of this group, I want to wrestle with the very old question of how we humanists conceptualize nature and culture. And here, the punchline for those of you who have to leave early to pick up kids, et cetera, is that my long-term goal for this research project is to try to move beyond general declarations about nature-culture interactions, which those of you who've read environmental history books, if you pay attention in the introduction, almost every environmental historian that I've read feels obligated in one way or another to make some reference to this notion of interactions. And I think it's a hugely important idea that still remains to be a message that needs to sort of get out there and get people to think about, especially in policy circles. But nevertheless, I think it does run the risk of becoming trite. And so I think I want to, in order to develop concepts that are more precise, my goal is to try to develop concepts a little more precise, can be applied to specific situations in order to move from a humanities perspective to what I want to suggest is prophecy, or that is to say predictions. I'm going to kind of dance the line here between humanities and social sciences, perhaps, as historians tend to do. And I said perhaps this prediction part will smack of positivist science, and we can talk about that and question and answer if people want to bring that up. A brief introduction or explanation of how I came to this topic, since few observers would confuse a banana plantation in Central America, the subject of what I will presumptuously call my first book, with a salmon farm in southern Chile. Indeed, it might be hard to find more disparate ecologies and cultures within what's generally considered to be Latin America than comparing a banana plantation, say, in Honduras with southern Chile. And yet, what I found striking, why I actually got drawn to this topic and tried to include it into a project that in some ways is focused on slightly different regions, slightly different organisms, is the compelling similarities, what at least struck me from a distance, the compelling similarities in terms of the dynamics, which include some things I'll try to talk about, the proliferation of diseases and parasites in continuously cultivated monocultures, and then the subsequent disruptions in production in both cases, I would say both in the export banana industry historically and still today, as well as in the salmon industry, has provoked both political conflict and led to the loss of thousands of livelihoods in these respective producing areas. So if true that nature presents those who try to industrialize organisms with surprises and obstacles that are unpredictable in any given locality and at precise moments, I think that at moments in time, I think environmental history demonstrates that boom and bust cycles, ecological changes, and unstable livelihoods are what I'm going to call overdetermined outcomes of large-scale monocultures directed by profit-seeking investors/managers intent on minimizing variations in perishable goods even as they seek out the biogeographical diversity and social inequalities that lend temporary comparative advantages. I know that's a mouthful, and I will try to unpack that in the course of the talk. Okay, aquaculture. In 2008, Chile was the second leading producer of farmed Atlantic salmon in the world and the primary exporter to Japan and the United States. That year, the Chilean industry exported about 445,000 tons of salmon. It was worth approximately $2.4 billion. And they employed tens of thousands of people. Estimates run as high as 53,000 I've seen, but they range from anywhere from, say, 30,000 to 50,000. And we can again talk about why that number is so hard to pin down. The rapid growth of the farmed salmon in southern Chile is part of a broader trend in Latin America where aquaculture has expanded over the past 30 years. Mangroves from Mexico to Ecuador have been converted into shrimp farms. Brazil is expanding its production of things like tilapias and carps. Honduras, the country derisively known as a banana republic, has become one of the world's leading exporters of fresh tilapia fillets to the United States in recent years. Now, this macro-regional trend, in turn, is part of a global pattern, a global tendency. Aquaculture is presently the fastest growing food production system in the world, expanding at an annual rate of 9%. This according to a recent overview of the industry by Jim Deanna, who's a fish ecologist. This is published in Bioscience in 2009. Of the leading 24 species of aquatic organisms harvested worldwide, 14 are produced primarily by aquaculture. And the rise of salmon farming itself is nothing short of spectacular in terms of its percentage of the industry, of the production, what we eat. For example, as late as 1980, catch fisheries, places like Alaska and elsewhere, provide virtually all the world's annual salmon supply. However, salmon aquaculture, after growing it, and I still can't believe these numbers actually, at an average annual rate of 20% or more between 1981 and 2006, now accounts for about 2/3 of total production of salmon and others that reaches supermarkets, restaurants, etc. Some analysts and boosters, I don't know if this is going to show up so well, have called aquaculture a blue revolution, drawing favorable comparison to the green revolution's transformation of agriculture, and they sort of claim as an added bonus the blue revolution can help ease stresses on overexploited catch fisheries. Most analysts argue that aquaculture will continue to expand for the foreseeable future because global fish consumption has doubled since the early 1970s. Well, since the late 1980s, harvest from catch fisheries has sort of plateaued around 80 or 90 million metric tons per year since the late 1980s. These are just some quotes. I'm not going to read these, but to give you a sense of who, to just pin down some language, since we always say people, The Economist in 2003 in a fairly often cited article talks about, invokes this notion of a blue revolution. The World Aquaculture Society, obviously a booster, I shouldn't say obviously, but it is an industry group, so obviously they're boosters, but they also make explicit reference to Norman Borlaug, who recently died, I guess, I think this past September, and the Green Revolution. A little aside, to not just to students, but especially maybe to students who perhaps wonder about the value of history, let me just suggest that if you're trying to evaluate the claims being made about the blue revolution, that some people call it, you need to know something about the green revolution, because here's a classic way people are using history. And so it's up to you to figure out how they're using it and why they're using it in the way they are, and if it's a complete story. So there's a prime example of practical uses of history and being able to analyze a discourse for its historical content. Okay. What is aquaculture? In brief, aquaculture is, and maybe most simply what I'm calling the directed growing. Deanna calls it the controlled growing, but for reasons that hopefully become clear, I'm not sure how much control there is. But it's certainly the human-directed growing of plants, invertebrates, reptiles, finfish in watery environments. Production process can vary widely by region and species, hence the very sort of broad definition. And just what I just want to call attention to, and it's relevant for the salmon industry, is some fish farming. You have an initial process in which the young fish are raised, they're hatched basically in some kind of fish hatchery, and then they'll be released to some kind of open watery environment and later caught, more or less in what you might think of being a traditional fish catchery approach. Other approaches to aquaculture, the salmon industry, of which the salmon industry is one example, is a much more directed process throughout the entire life cycle that involves from hatchery to harvest. And so it means you have inputs of food, feed, water circulation, oxygen, other inputs like vaccines, antibiotics. All these are going to be administered to organisms living in, like I say, contained, in, at least what ostensibly are contained environments. Okay, salmon aquaculture in Chile. Here's a little map finder for you guys. So this is, Chile obviously is on the Pacific side, hence my uncle's perplexity about Atlantic salmon. Pacific side of South America, and what you're looking at here, I don't know how well this shows up, is this region, which this is one part, not entirely, but part of the main salmon growing region in Chile, where the industry is sort of born and has existed up until to the present moment. What's known as the main region is the Lakes region, is another region further south known as Aysén. Puerto Montt is the main town. Any of you guys who have maybe gone backpacking or hiking in sort of these areas, these are popular tourist areas, also very high-end sport fishing goes on. Puerto Montt is one of those pass-through towns. You might fly into the airport and then buy some groceries or supplies you need and then set off on your expedition. Puerto Montt has also become the center of the aquaculture industry, so a lot of people in there, their economy has become very dependent on aquaculture. The island here is Chiloé. For those of you not familiar, it might sound a little confusing. I could say more about this, but Chiloé is a big island, suffice to say. It's had a history that actually is somewhat distinct from mainland Chile. The people are called Chilotes. They distinguish themselves from Chileans to the north. Chileans distinguish them. There's a lot of sort of stereotypes and vernacular language and customs and things that are somewhat unique to the island of Chiloé. The region's irregular coastline, now I want to talk a little about the geography though. The region's irregular coastline, and I'll see if this map can convey. This is now you're looking sort of an aerial shot from the Pacific looking eastward. So this is the mountains, this is Argentina, this is Chiloé, now sort of turned on its side, so to speak. And this is the Gulf region. This is the area where a lot of the salmon aquaculture has been concentrated up till 2007 or 8 or so. And partly because the waters have been found to be, they're protected, they're marine waters, which salmon need, of course, grow as adults and live as adults in salt water, in seawater. And so this water is somewhat protected. This provides a certain protected area, the right temperature, the right salinity that people who dedicate themselves to aquaculture believe is ideal for salmon production. There's also a lot of fresh water that comes down. A lot of it's fed by snowmelt and glaciers from the Andes that come down through these various fjords. And up to the north here, you can't quite see it, but there's some freshwater lakes that are important to the system too. So this combination, relative proximity of pretty clean freshwater lakes with pretty clean marine environments, where it's seen as being a major comparative advantage from the perspective of economists who study aquaculture. There's just one, and here's an image of some of the rivers in the region. And another comparative advantage I want to mention is the presence of, in Chile, is one of the poorest regions in all of Chile, which relatively speaking for Latin America is considered to be an affluent country. But in Chile, they're in the 1970s and 80s characterized by high rates of unemployment, relatively speaking, high rates of poverty as well. And that certainly is a comparative advantage insofar as the government was very much interested in job creation, and certainly encouraged the salmon industry for that reason as well. So there are those, what I call, three comparative advantages of a low-wage labor force and these natural resources. But there's just one little detail, one thing that was lacking, and that is salmon. There are no salmon that are native to southern Chile, to the waters. And efforts to introduce salmon have actually had, in my mind, was a surprisingly long history. Going back at least 100 years, you can find evidence of various people in Chile, government officials in particular, trying to introduce salmon to Chilean waters. I'm going to summarize here so I don't just try to stay somewhat on time. But suffice to say that from the beginning of the 1880s, you had efforts to introduce salmon from San Francisco. You had efforts to do it from Germany, from France, and the salmon themselves followed some really circuitous routes. So you had the French, I think in the late 19th century, the French Acclimatization Society introduced salmon from California, apparently successfully. And then the Chileans actually tried to introduce salmon originating in California from France, as well as from Germany. And so there's a whole sort of long history here that still needs to be told. There's a Chilean fisheries person actually who's written a history that's quite good. That explores a lot of this. But there's a long history there that needs to be thought about. Certainly, as I say, the salmon industry was not the first people who had the idea of bringing salmon. I should say salmonids, because this includes Atlantic salmon and also things like rainbow trout and other fish that biologists lump together as salmonids. The end result, though, of these efforts in the 19th century was, in fact, where they were not successful. And the Chilean government continues into the 20th century. And in 1910, they do establish a fish hatchery in this lake here, Lago Yanquihue. Established in 1910, they introduced salmon along with some kinds of trouts. And in fact, initially they have some success. The population of brown and rainbow trout do, in fact, start to reproduce themselves. Atlantic salmon have a brief period of productivity, and then by 1939, they disappear from the hatchery records. So they're there sort of briefly in the early 30s. By 39, they apparently have died off. A renewed push for salmon, and I can talk about why that is too if we want to talk about that in question and answer. A renewed push for introducing salmon to southern Chile occurred in the 1970s. I suspect there's some history in between there, but I'm going to sort of jump ahead here to get to the aquaculture. And this follows the creation of an organization, or an institute, I should say, called Fundación Chile, which is simply the Chilean Foundation. And this has, though, an interesting history that's, I think, worth talking a little bit about. The Fundación Chile was established as part of an agreement between the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet and the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, ITT, which might be familiar for those of you who were either alive during this time or know a little bit of this history. ITT was a U.S. multinational whose Chilean assets were nationalized by the government of Salvador Allende following ITT's vigorous support of covert efforts to undermine Allende's rise to power, first his election and then his coming to power. So the sort of an ironic outcome then of this sort of expropriation and then sort of in a sense reprivatization was a deal in a sense cut between Pinochet and ITT to create this foundation, the objective of which by their own annual report is, quote, the development of scientific research and technology with economic applications, close quote. In the early 1980s, Fundación Chile, under the direction of an engineer, they always pop up, guy by the name of Wayne Sandvig. I have not investigated him yet, don't know if he's either a CMU or a Case Western graduate, but at any rate, somehow this engineer gets interested in aquaculture and he starts to promote it, initially on the island of Chiloé, and so the Fundación Chile creates an enterprise. And one thing to note here for those of you interested in neoliberalism and the history of neoliberalism, Chile is oftentimes portrayed as sort of the darling of the neoliberals and the neoliberal model in the 1980s. But I think it is interesting to note, and here some other scholars have already written about this, that the Chilean state was actually quite active in the creation of this industry, at least getting it going. So the extent that we tend to think of neoliberalism as being the absence of a state I certainly want to suggest the state was actually quite active in particular ways, operating in particular ways, for sure, but nevertheless quite active. They initially start with what they called salmon ranching, which is this idea I mentioned before, where they hatch the fish out, put them out in the open sea, and then go out and catch them. That's the initial way. It has some success, enough economic success that the Fundación Chile sells the company to a Japanese firm. The Fundación Chile later builds a couple of processing plants. I believe the initial ones were canneries. This is still before they're exporting sort of fresh or frozen fillets and whole fish. And also they build some more hatcheries. And then again, the model is in this keeping in with, now this is more conforming with the neoliberal model perhaps, then they would spin these off. So they'd create them, get them productive, sell them off to investors. And this is how the sort of industry gets started in southern Chile, late 80s, early 90s. By the late 1990s, there's a lot of more private capitals come in, Chilean initially, some as evidenced by the Japanese firm, some transnational capital as well. Increasingly, there'd be Norwegian companies would come in too by the beginning of this century. And by the late 1990s, so Chilean farms are starting to export large quantities of fish to the United States. In fact, interestingly enough, they're exporting so much salmon to the United States that some salmon fishers in the U.S. filed an anti-dumping suit against Chile in 1997. Not surprisingly, the prices start to fall as there's a glut on the market, and this prompts Chilean firms to start to seek ways to add value to the product. And this adopts a strategy that, to me, goes back to what people like William Cronin and others have written about with Swift and the meat packing. They realized that rather than exporting whole fish to, say, Japan or to particularly the United States, if they build processing plants, do the filleting, and send them on airplanes, they can pack a lot more fish in that's going to actually be sold as opposed to the waste product and send it off to Chile. So in many ways, picking on the same kind of models, the same technological package in a sense of refrigeration, transportation network, and sort of a fossil fuel economy, fossil fuel food chain, if you will, gets created in southern Chile. So now between 1996 and 2000, exports of fresh salmon fillets increased about fivefold, and by 2001, these fillets constitute about 60% of the exports. So there's a shift, again, from whole fish to value-added processed fish, and this, of course, has implications for labor demands in Chile. And most farms this time also shift to Atlantic salmon, and this is going to become important because they could be harvested throughout the calendar year. This is something for reasons I don't fully understand the sort of social biodynamics here yet. But in contrast to, say, coho salmon, which up to that time had been harvested somewhat seasonally, which initially was an advantage because you could harvest coho salmon opposite of when the season was in the U.S., so that was sort of an initial advantage. But then they decided to take it one step further and say, well, hey, we can do Atlantic salmon year-round. Let's do that. And so there's a shift to Atlantic salmon to sort of largely eliminate the seasonality of consumption patterns. Again, for those of you who study food and stuff, a familiar story for food commodities. Around the same time in the United States and elsewhere, a series of medical studies suggest that the omega-3 and polyunsaturated fat contained in salmon provide a lot of health benefits, and you get a big spike in consumption of salmon in the United States. It is apparently the most popular fin fish consumed in the U.S. However, one thing I want to mention, there's an interesting paper I read, and I think it was called Agriculture and Human Values, a thing about consumption. And their data, they acknowledge the data is somewhat difficult to get a handle on. But apparently from the early 1980s to about 2000, total production of protein as measured by, say, let's say beef, chicken, pork, and fish in the United States, that total production actually increased. So even though you might have the perception, which is not inaccurate, of people eating, say, less red meat, more chicken, less pork, more fish, the total protein availability in the United States went up dramatically. So in other words, this is not a question of sort of, for people who are framing this as kind of an alternative, possibly more sustainable way of producing protein than, say, raising cattle or pork or something like that. The first question to ask is, well, is this really a substitution, as sometimes is implicitly suggested, or is this in fact simply adding more protein to a culture that arguably already has, generally speaking, certainly has more protein than most of the rest of the world, to be sure. Okay. Of course, forgot to show the slide. This is forever. It's worth. The Fundación Chile is still very much an actor and a player, and creates a lot of spin-off businesses in Chile. I've seen some papers recently that's upheld oftentimes as a model. A couple scholars who work on sort of development issues in Africa have actually written a paper explicitly suggesting the Fundación Chile should be a model for for development, for sort of indigenous capitalism, if you will, I guess. Okay, genealogy of Chile's Atlantic salmon. can be traced to Norway, okay, where in the late 1960s, early 70s, people started to do aquaculture. Okay, Norwegians is generally identified as the first place where salmon aquaculture takes place. Keep in mind, there's a whole story here about Asia, China in particular, about a long, long history of aquaculture that I'm not addressing. So this is specific to salmon. Scientists, in Norway, they start to selectively breed salmon. They develop 5 strains that are derived from salmon taken primarily from Norwegian rivers. Selection is based primarily on body weight, along with some other things like color, resistance to certain diseases, sort of fecundity, things that are fairly typical. Again, those of you know something about the history of breeding of cattle, of other kinds of livestock and terrestrial domesticated animals, fairly similar set of qualities that were considered, characteristics that were considered desirable and bred for by the salmon breeders. However, one difference between, say, salmon, if you're breeding salmon and, say, a cow or a pig, is that the fecundity of Atlantic salmon exceeds that of cattle, hogs, and chickens by several orders of magnitude. So what this means is that much higher levels of what biologists would call selection, right, evolutionary forces, if you will, can be applied over a brief period of time. Now, one outcome of this, according to scientists, some biologists who have studied this, is that, in fact, these intensive selection pressures has been already a significant decline in the genetic diversity of those farm strains. So in other words, you've got these 5 strains selected, which is already, in a sense, reducing your biological diversity, and now even with those 5 strains, there's been a dramatic decline in biological diversity to the extent that you can interpret that through DNA analysis. The production cycle of farmed salmon, so that's where salmon come from Norway. So that's how we have salmon, to answer the question. Literally, my uncle, the salmon don't really originate in Chile. The genetic base, so to speak, comes from Norway, and they get transported, commodified, sent to southern Chile, where they're then cultivated. This is an example. I was in Chile in this past December. This is a region not on the island of Chiloé, where, as you'll see some photos, the salmon industry is basically all but to come to a halt by 2009. This is sort of on the other side of that bay, closer to Argentina. This is a place called Hornopiren, where this is a company that has a contained salmon hatchery. Initially, the tactic was to, I'm going to jump back here for a second if I can do this, was to raise the fish, take advantage of these freshwater lakes, which I alluded to before, like Yanquiwe, and cultivate the salmon in sort of open nets. So they'd be initially bred, and when they're very, very small, but then once they achieved maybe a certain size, I can't remember, maybe 6 or 7 grams, they'd be put in very fine mesh nets and essentially cages and put in to the open water. Now this had certain implications, or I should say certain potential biological risks, I guess I'd say, were associated with this. And so let me talk a little bit about this. Lago Yanquiwe is home to several endemic species of fish, meaning only found in this lake, in addition to some species that are exclusive to the southern hemisphere. Now, I mentioned that as early as 1910, you've got introduced rainbow trout, brown trout, that are also continue to be abundant. I think it's safe to say, this is an environmental history waiting to be written, but I think it's safe to say that introduction probably had a pretty big impact on the native fish, which can roughly be considered cichlids. Some of you are familiar with fish. So I think it's safe to say there's probably initial big impact decline probably in the population of the native species at that time, but this, like I said, is a history that still remains to be written, so it's uncertain. But what we do know is that these introduced fish have lured a lot of recreational anglers. Tourism is very popular around this lake among Chileans as well as internationals, and it has become indeed a popular tourist destination. At the same time, though, it's also become a center of aquaculture, which has created its own interesting political dynamics. And between 1995 and 2005, it's estimated some 270 million smolts, which are the little salmons, little pescaditos, were raised in Lago Yanquiwe. During this time, Chilean law did not impose any kind of reporting requirements on fish escapes, so we don't really know the escape rate. But if it was anything comparable to what was measured in Norway and Scotland at this time under similar basic kind of production processes, you can estimate anywhere between 8 and 14 million smolts may have escaped into Lago Yanquiwe at this period. Now that, of course, sounds like a huge number. Obviously, you've got to consider the vast majorities are probably going to be eaten, again, by other fish or die for other reasons. In fact, interestingly, they all die because, in fact, they don't reproduce themselves in this environment so far. As noted, Atlantic salmon have yet to form self-sustaining populations in Yanquihue, but this doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility that escapees from aquaculture facilities exert effects on the freshwater species. As I've sort of already suggested, and there is at least one study that shows a negative correlation between places where you have aquaculture taking place in the lakes and the populations of endemic species. Again, it's a synchronic analysis. No, it's a snapshot. The studies, I think, were done in the early, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, so it doesn't tell us anything about change over time, but what we can clearly see is that if you have a lake where you don't have any kind of smolts being cultivated and released, you have a much higher presence, at least one study indicated a much higher presence of these endemic species. I don't think this is a shock. Again, certainly you can find other historical examples of these enclosed lakes where introducing carnivorous fish that are able to reproduce eat up a lot of the native fish. In Honduras, the United Fruit Company, one of my favorite actors to study, among the other things they did in Honduras was introduce bass for sport fishing, and the bass in a lake called Lago Yohoa, which again had some native fish, and the bass population went crazy and presumably feeding on a lot of the native fish. The bass population eventually crashed, but there's a brief period of time in the 50s and 60s when well-heeled fisher folk were going to Honduras to fish bass in Lago Yohoa. So again, environmental history provides, I think, a number of examples to give us some sense about what we might anticipate. Doesn't always mean it's absolutely right, but it gives us some things, at least some hypotheses we can make, I think. Another thing, just to add about the lakes, to show about, for those of you interested in sort of globalization and issues of health impacts, things that can be, again, surprises, you might say. In this lake, one of the other things that's happened is that as the salmon, so they're in fresh water, so they're also exposed. It's a two-way thing. The salmon are getting out into the Lago Yanquihue, but also whatever's in Lago Yanquihue is potentially being ingested by the salmon. One of the things the salmon apparently ingest are some parasites, parasite is a tapeworm. This is relevant because, well, this has been an endemic sort of parasite in the region, and people who do eat the fish out of there it's a public health problem, I guess I'd call it maybe a moderate public health problem in and around Chile that public health officials are aware of and studying, encouraging people, to be careful about eating raw fish. But because some of the salmon, right, they're taken out, the little smolts, they eventually grow, they're taken out, grown out to full size, and then exported. There's at least one case of Chilean salmon being exported to Brazil. I think it was Rio, I can't remember if it's Rio, turned into sushi. People eat the raw salmon and then get affected by this tapeworm. So again, I'm not suggesting this is not a public health epidemic, but again, it just shows these kinds of things that can happen. It's a risk that I would argue ultimately the companies that have invested in the salmon thing don't really take on as their own responsibility, right? So this is a way of sort of externalizing an element of production. And so what I want to suggest about Lago Yanquihue then is in terms of sort of to engage some of the things we hear about oftentimes from, say, economists, development economists and things. This idea of a comparative advantage then that Lago Yanquihue represents, it's important to recognize that this is simultaneously, it's a historical condition, meaning it's certainly subject to change, and it's also a certain way of understanding a particular place. Okay, it's a very, I would argue it's a simplification. To borrow a problematic term that James Scott has used, or I should say a term that James Scott has used perhaps problematically, but nevertheless I think this is a case where you do have sort of a simplification of an approach to understanding, right, by just saying this is a comparative advantage. Well, it's a short-term comparative advantage, and it's only an advantage if you're willing to externalize some of these other things I've talked about, the risk of losing the local biodiversity and the potential risk of creating public health problems that can take on transnational dimensions. Okay. Our salmon, let's come back to follow our salmon. And this is the other thing I think that's just interesting. Richard White, those of you I know, one of the graduates mentioned reading The Organic Machine. I think it's a great book, and I think he actually talks about some of this, what goes on with sort of salmon hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River Basin. So you hatch out your salmon, you have your salmon in Lago Yanquihue, let's say, for example, and then there comes a certain point when they need to go to the salt water, right? What salmon would do if they're in a river would migrate downstream on their own power, using their own energy. But of course, you can't do that in this kind of situation. You need to use human energy and fossil fuels. So you see here, it's a little bit maybe hard to see. These are two flatbed trucks, or actually there's probably about 4 there on this sort of mid-sized boat that is carrying all these white things have live fish in them. They've got oxygen tanks, and there's somebody sort of out there I think that's kind of monitoring. And these are going to be taken to a sea pen where they'll be pumped into the sea pen to grow and mature. And in the process, again, this is a process, the technological dimensions I don't fully understand or detailed, but as they're being transported, there's a change in the salinity of the water because, of course, they can't go, salmon would not just go from, say, literally be plunged from fresh water to salt water. So there is a way, apparently, that the salmon are flexible enough, though they can do this process pretty quickly, go from the salinity can change fairly abruptly, and then they get introduced to a salmon farm. Now, I should say, for honesty here, and especially since this is being filmed, this is in December 2009. By the point when I was taking these pictures, a virus, I'm going to talk about the Isa virus, had come in and already devastated a lot of the Atlantic salmon production, and it declined dramatically. In this side, this is Ornopiren. It's possible, this is an active fish farm, it's possible it's some other kind of salmon. I wasn't able to ask the people working there, in part because I'm on the land and the people working there are here. If I were to go back and spend more time, obviously one could find this out, but so just for technical, this could be, actually might likely be another kind of salmon, like a coho salmon, that would be harvested from here, taken to a processing plant, probably smoked, and sent to Japan. So there still is some salmon industry going on, but it's not necessarily Atlantic salmon. But this generally gives you an idea of how salmon would be raised. As I said, the people, let's say the workers, would live and work here. I'm sorry, this doesn't show up a little better. And then the salmon are going to live, and the fish will live here. There's lines running out that's controlling, this, monitoring oxygen, sending feed out, providing information to the workers about what's going on with rates of feeding, rates of oxygen levels, and things like that. Fairly highly technified in that sense, increasingly technified in terms of monitoring that goes on via information that's being sent back and forth. A couple other just details. So this is a close-up now of one of the salmon pen. And these would be approximately, say, 20 meters deep, and then they started to get a little deeper around the turn of the century. The industry looking to expand, and this is one of the things you can do in an aquaculture situation. If it's agriculture, you kind of got to expand this way. In aquaculture, you might go this way, you might go this way. And so they actually went deeper in this case, and that is, I'm going to come back to that. I mentioned that because I'll come back to that in a second. Just a couple other things to highlight here. Here you can see, if I take this picture a little better, on the left is feed. This is another dimension of aquaculture. Those of you who may be somewhat familiar with aquaculture and the criticisms and concerns that environmentalists and sustainable development advocates have maintained, that this feed, which is basically fish meal, fish oil, this is a classic input, right? Just the same way fertilizer, gets inputted to a banana plantation. You've got post-1950, you've got a lot of feed inputs coming in here to feed the salmon. And so the feed is one certainly key item. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there's actually a graduate student at Duke who's working on environmental history of the Peruvian and Chilean anchovy industry, which is the main basis along with some other fish for the fish meal industry, which is an important study, I think, to do. This is, these here are where dead fish get deposited. As fish die for whatever reason, they're removed from the pens and deposited there. To the extent that there's a little bit of a recycling process that goes on, I was able to talk to a few workers, and some of these fish do actually go to like fish oil. There are a few fish oil, I think they're fish oil plants in the region, and so they do get turned into fish meal. Whether that raises the prospect of salmon eating salmon, I don't really know. If that bothers you, it's something to contemplate. I don't know what it means, but I'll just throw that out there. It seems like it's at least possible. This is just, again, another view of this. From the social side of things, workers, I interviewed one. I did not spend a lot of time here. I should say this is not, as I said, this has sort of become, I frankly sense the urgency of this issue, and as I said, the compellingness of similarities made me want to study this. I did a fairly quick hit and run kind of research in December. I did do a couple interviews with some women, one of whom had a husband who had passed away, but he had worked on one of these. And she mentioned how, you definitely, as you would go for maybe a week. Some of these are really isolated. This one, is pretty close to shoreline, but some do require, maybe an hour or so travel in a boat. They're fairly isolated just in terms of roadways and other kinds of infrastructure, hospital infrastructure, medical care. So you would spend maybe a week or two and come back sort of on the weekends kind of thing. So it does have, there's a whole sort of social side too. Obviously it needs to be researched about the uniqueness of the work associated with this kind of aquaculture. The fish would then be, they're brought in these well boats, and they're actually sort of, this is a little bit, then again on the shore, there's a processing plant behind me that for some stupid reason I forgot to take a picture of, and the fish would be offloaded here and sort of pumped through these pipes and up into the processing plant where they'll be processed, filleted, or whatever, however kind of processing is going to happen. Let me just say a little bit about these pens, though, before moving on. From an ecological standpoint, these fish pens provide the salmon with both protection and what we might think of as being room service. So in other words, in contrast to open ocean salmon populations, farm salmon, they don't have to expend energy or dodge predators while they're foraging. And so this quickens the pace at which they grow, hence the desire to do this if you're looking to make a sustainable profit. These efficiencies, though, notwithstanding, like I said, have led some scholars, including particularly Rosamund Naylor, who's I think an economist at Stanford, who has argued that cultivation of this kind of finfish, carnivorous finfish, is like raising tigers of the sea, because you do, in fact, give them the rate at which the salmon can convert the feed to human protein that ratio has gotten better, but you still have to basically feed more fish to the salmon than what you get out of it. So again, it's kind of an old, for those of you who are vegetarians, you are probably familiar with this story about sort of energy conversions in diets. Just as an aside, so one of the things the industry is trying to do, because of course industry people tend to not stand still, is recognizing both the criticism and the desire. Fish meal is about 50% of the production cost, so that's significant, to say the least. To try to lower that, they're trying to actually decrease the content of fish oil and fish meal in the feed. Anyone want to take a guess what they're trying to substitute in? What's that? Corn is a good one, but I haven't heard of corn. They're probably trying that. There's another one. Soy. Yeah, soy is the one that apparently already is in some of the feed, and they're trying to bring that in. So again, just to think about these connections, not to for sustainability. If you want to think about aquaculture, you also have, if increasingly it's going to be looking at having a soy input, you've got to think about what's going on with the soy, where and how is that being produced. Okay, so concentrating fish, perhaps not surprisingly, concentrating fish in a confined area in order to feed them, a practice that is probably, again, many of you know, has been adopted by beef, pork, and poultry industries in the United States and elsewhere, also generates a concentration of waste. And so in both northern and southern hemisphere farming sites, in other words, whether you're in Norway or Chile, organic wastes have altered the chemical properties of sort of the benthic zone, the soil basically bottom, the microflora and the fauna. Fish pens also can pollute marine environments more extensively, as if you're administering things like antibiotics, which the Chilean industry has done. It's received a lot of criticism for this, and there's a lot of controversy, and again, unfortunately, opacity in terms of understanding what exactly the companies have done historically. Well, we know they use things like tetracycline, for example, has been used as an antibiotic. Copper-based anti-fouling paints. If you have these structures, like any ship or anything else, spending a lot of time in salt water, subject to corrosion, and so you've got to treat these, you've got to periodically clean and maintenance these things. You use copper as one way to do it. Copper has pretty high toxicity for many kinds of plants, for sure, and some kinds of aquatic organisms. That's potentially another environmental problem. Also, parasitides are used as well. One called malachite green, which has actually now been banned. But there's also some others that are used. So there are chemical inputs as well as feed inputs. Again, not unlike what you might find in a banana plantation conceptually. Obviously different chemicals, different kinds of fertilizers, but conceptually very similar. Okay, let me just say one thing about protecting salmon, because at this point, some of the humanists in the room might say, well, where are the people in this story? So if we're talking about aquaculture, we can literally talk about writing a history from below, because one of the key labor issues that's emerged is the fact that to clean these things, to service these, to pull dead fish out, you have to go into the water and you have to dive into the water. So the aquaculture industry employs a lot of scuba divers. It contracts a lot of scuba divers, this is certainly something that is rather different from a banana plantation, where I've never heard of United Fruit employing any scuba divers. However, the Chilean industry, this is regular practice again, in terms of maintenance of these sea pens. And they're known as in southern Chile, they're referred to as buzos, B-U-Z-O-S. And they monitor, they clean, they repair the pens, as I said. Now, again, data here gets real shaky, but according to some Chilean NGOs that monitor the salmon industry, approximately 14 divers died on the job over a 15-month period between 2006 and 2007. and at least 8 divers died in 2008 that were recorded. I think that was only through part of the year. I haven't seen, and then the industry is going to sort of collapse in 2009. Now, as is often the case with workplace deaths, where there's not a lot of regulation and monitoring required, there's a lot of conflicting information about how and why and sort of who ultimately or what structures may be responsible for these deaths. Aquaculture industry officials, perhaps not surprisingly, have implicitly blamed the divers, arguing that the boom in salmon farming created a shortage of professional divers. In other words, there were people who maybe weren't properly trained, who were trying to sort of pass themselves off as divers to get a job. Maybe it was true. One could imagine certainly that scenario with some individuals. But a couple of things that I think details are interesting to think about, and again, there's a lot of opportunity here for further research. During the initial years of production, companies made extensive use of local divers who are known as mariscadores, which literally could be sort of shellfish divers. So there's, again, this comes back to the sort of comparative advantage in a cultural or social dimension. In Chile, there's a long history of people doing shellfish diving. So this, again, was not an entirely new concept. It's sort of a new idea to be introduced to people, but sort of a new application for divers. Now, initially, they're illegally, those who worked for the salmon industry, there was some regulations, and they were supposed to not dive into any greater depths than about 20 meters. However, around 2000, as I already alluded to, when the industry decided to start expanding vertically, that is to say going deeper with their sea pens, that then meant divers had to go beyond 20 meters in some cases, and this started to create some problems. The industry, or challenges, I guess, in the sense the industry needed divers who could go deeper. They lobbied the government to change the laws to enable people to dive to a depth of now 36 meters, and they get that approved. And again, the meanings of these changes are disputed. Some people said this obviously created opportunities for skilled divers, and there's divers who were able to get the training and get the license. Other NGOs, of course, have pointed attention to the increased risks and the dangers and this high death rate that has caused understandable concern. And other people have suggested that indeed, actually, this caused many divers to lose their jobs precisely because they could not get the license and the accreditation from the government to do this kind of diving that was required. So again, I just sort of mentioned that there is a whole sort of, again, sort of social history in sociology to be explored further. So Atlantic salmon production in southern Chile then has created new ecosocial dynamics by concentrating populations of an exotic species, in this case Atlantic salmon, with local people, including these mariscadores, parasites like sea lice, and I should add predators who I didn't really mention, but sea lions. There's also sea lions, again, if you want, sea lions actually are known as lobos marinos, literally sea wolves. In Spanish is perhaps a better thing, because again, if you want to make an analogy to terrestrial-based agriculture, if you congregate a bunch of sheep, you tend to draw things like wolves. If you congregate a bunch of salmon in the water, you tend to draw sea wolves, in this case, marine mammals such as sea lions. So there's sort of there's sort of around the sea pens, there's sort of stronger sort of fences or some kind of barriers erected to try to keep out sea lions, which has worked. Again, there's some environmental organizations have accused salmon farms of killing sea lions fairly regularly. That's been reported. But the point is here, you've got dynamics bringing all these things together, right, to the same sort of space. And so this combination of human actors and non-human components, on one hand, is undeniably particular to the place and time period. But again, I want to call attention to the dynamic, and I don't think it's particularly surprising, and I think I would argue it fits into historical patterns associated with creating profits, or let's say accumulation by concentrating energy and resources while, again, externalizing the risks. Okay, I'm going to jump to the talk about the virus here, and then I'll try to open things up for questions, because I suspect I'm going on too long here. So when I visited, as I said, when I visited southern Chile in last December, I didn't really see any Atlantic salmon pens operating, which is kind of remarkable, remembering those statistics I gave you as recently as 2007. The company's exporting, the region is exporting hundreds of thousands of tons of salmon, and 2 years later, it's collapsed. Why? The ecosocial dynamic responsible for this devastation is due to something known as infectious salmon anemia, ISA, which is a virus that was first detected in Norway in 1984. I've got a map that I don't think is going to show up so well, but so first you've got, this is between 1984 and 2007, and the arrows sort of indicate the different places that ISA viruses appeared where Atlantic salmon is farmed. And so in Canada in 1996, Scotland 1998, northeastern United States, year 2000, ISA has spread, followed where salmon are cultivated. First recorded detection of ISA virus in Chile is believed to be 1999. As you can find, a scientist published a paper in 1999 saying we've detected it in coho salmon that had been introduced from North America. Now, because coho salmon are not susceptible to the ISA virus, that is to say, if you're trying to cultivate coho salmon for whatever reason, for a market, for commodity purposes, you don't really have to be too preoccupied about that virus because it's not going to have a big impact. It's not going to kill the fish, essentially. So, but I would argue it certainly should have served as a warning, particularly when this shift happened to Atlantic salmon. And indeed, I should add here, for those of you who maybe think this is sort of too looking, value of hindsight, at least two scholars, one a geographer and one, I believe, a sociologist, in at least 5 or 6 years before the ISA virus really hits the Atlantic salmon industry, they point this out, that this is, this industry is very fragile and susceptible to this virus coming in. And like I said, again, it had been detected. It was clearly in the water by 1999. How abundant is unclear, but it was there. 2007, ISA disease breaks out in 2 Atlantic salmon pens on a farm located in central Chiloé, that island I had mentioned, and produced very high rates of mortality. Now let me just give you a little bit of a glimpse of what's going on in these 2 pens to again get the sense of the ecological dynamism here. The fish were already recovering from another disease, the outbreak of which had been brought under control by antibiotics. Sea lice were determined to have infected about 63% of the salmon who they sampled, the dead salmon they pulled out, see what had happened, who were living in the pens. So you've got, again, all kinds of what I like to call critters, sort of operating in that environment that, again, is ostensibly controlled, but of course not entirely controlled, or at least not as much as one needs to if you want to make a sustainable, persistent profit, that's to say year in, year out. So as I said, even this brief description then shows you some of this complexity of what's going on in these farms. You've got a bacterial infection, of virus, and parasites all happening simultaneously. I'm going to skip over. There's more to say about sea lice. I don't know if one gets led into these topics. I really was intending to read about sea lice, but I've got a stack of papers. Maybe you want to know something about sea lice. But sea lice is actually quite serious, again, for fish farmers. And it's found in virtually all the sea pens of southern Chile. Sea lice feed on the mucus, the skin, the blood of fish. And as often the case with parasitic organisms, their populations positively correlates to the densities of the host population. So again, it's kind of density dependent. The presence of the population of this parasite is certainly density dependent with the host. And again, to check these things, you use a combination of chemicals and management techniques. Now, ISA continues to spread throughout 2007, reaches a crisis proportion in the last quarter of 2008, and it's at this point when the government finally sort of is forced to step in. The large companies, the industry's consolidated somewhat in the beginning of the 2000s. Marine Harvest, which is a Norway-based company, although major stockholders, I believe, are in Cyprus in the United States. It operates a lot of fish farms in southern Chile. They start to close, shut down all their farms. They shut down processing plants. And basically, again, to continue the agricultural metaphor, the Chilean industry goes fallow. And this is largely under the order of the government, who says, no, we're going to go 3-month fallow period to see if we can see what happens to the population of the virus in the water. The hope, presumably, that the water will kind of clean itself, or at least lower the levels of the virus. So this, essentially, when I then got to, return to, this image is really not worth showing, but this is Chiloé here, the island. So Puerto Montt would be up here, and these red dots, if you can see them, are where the ISA virus broke out. Unfortunately, the dates get dropped out, but basically this is 2007, 2008. It proliferates in regionally. So you've got a huge crisis. And so when I got there in 2009, this image was probably more common, or at least as common as the one I showed you before of the working farm, where you'd see things that had been abandoned. For those of you interested in social banditry, some people told me that fisher folk and others would come along and kind of appropriate stuff, materials that they found useful from these abandoned farms. Some people said the companies were actually removing the stuff, and I saw some evidence they in fact hauled it out and were storing it on shoreline. Other cases, apparently, they just had left the things. In some cases, they'd been subject to damage by storms. And like I said, some people suggested people were appropriating whatever materials they found useful from that. So you have a situation where the industry basically shuts down very quickly. Classic bust. One of the biggest booms, in maybe recent memory of an economy in Latin America has a very, very thundering bust. And so what's the implications of this? Not surprisingly, the company, and this is Marine Harvest Chile General Manager Alvaro Jimenez, sort of somewhat candidly says in 2009, Marine Harvest is not willing to risk great amounts of money and incur major losses brought about by the elimination of sick fish. So how do you do that if you're a general manager? Well, you lay off your workers. And so that's what has happened, and is still sort of happening. There's thousands of workers have been dismissed in southern Chile when I was there. And this is another image of this would have been. You can see some remainders here of what would have been, presumably at one time, salmon farms in this region. This is from now the island of Chile. It's now sort of been abandoned. And you've had anywhere, again, reductions in payrolls from between 25 to 50%, an order of thousands, at least thousands, if not tens of thousands of workers laid off. One of the difficulties with getting good numbers on this is the industry has relied a lot on contractors. It's called a cluster. So instead of having, you have sort of a certain degree of vertical integration, but you also have a lot of use of contractors and subcontractors. So a lot of Chilean capital and Chilean medium and small businesses have been involved and sustained by the industry. Just to give you one maybe, well, I don't think trivial example, but an example of when I'm in a store, frankly, buying a souvenir for my daughter, start chatting with the guy working there and about the salmon industry, and he says, oh yeah, I think it was his cousin, had created a company to make parkas, right? So in other words, because this industry, the workers are out in the sea pens, it's quite cold, I should add. This is it's never particularly warm in this part of Chile, southern Chile. And also, if you're working the processing plants, it's always cold because that's, the temperature is purposely kept low. And so this guy had made, an industry, a business making parkas for the industry. Well, in 2009, not surprisingly, companies, of course, no longer ordering parkas, and you can imagine the guy was, couldn't pay off his debts, and so essentially was bankrupt. Presumably, that's just, again, one anecdote, but it's probably safe to say that kind of sort of ripple effect is happening throughout this region. I'll sort of end with, let me just say one other thing, too, that I think is kind of interesting, because, again, this reminded me a lot of the banana plantations. So this is an image of a fish hatchery. So again, now we're back to a freshwater environment where they're hatching out salmon. And this is a guy who's working there, temporary worker, as almost all these people are. He's not from the area. He'd been working in the job for about 2 weeks. Unfortunately, he's on the phone a lot, so I could take some pictures because I couldn't get in otherwise. They wouldn't let me in because the word of, and you're not going to be able to read this, but it's down here, but the big word is biosecurity, bioseguridad. The industry is obsessed about trying to prevent the movement of pathogens and the spread of pathogens. So you've got things like, as vehicles enter, those who are authorized to enter get sprayed with some kind of fungicidal, so in some cases a fungicide, some kind of disinfectant. Workers enter in, and that's what this sort of says here, which you can't, this is a message from the management, and it tells these biosecurity measures. Little things, workers take off their shoes, they have to put on special boots. And the thing that called to my attention is you can find the exact same things happening in 1920s in Honduras on the banana plantations. When you have a pathogen spread, they realized a machete could spread it. The hoof of an animal, of a burro, a mule, workers' shoes. So you have very kind of classic kind of biosecurity, in a banana plantation, efforts to try to prevent the spread of the disease, which were largely in vain. And here you see similar efforts to try to do that. Maybe it won't be in vain this time, but again, I wouldn't sort of bet on it, in part because of the social part they want to emphasize. Like this, not to sort of blame the people, right? But this guy who's just working, he's just an office worker, but he's an example. He's a temporary laborer there. This is a part-time work for him. The extent to which he understands, particularly cares deeply about these biosecurity measures, I would say is debatable. And partly, I think that's the structure and the nature of the employment. And literally, he's migrating around. So I'll sort of leave this image up, just to remind people that there are other kinds of fish that one can still purchase in southern Chile, in addition to salmon, including a lot of native species that are still in the oceans. And let me sort of stop there. I've got a few sort of reflections and summations, but I think I've talked enough. So why don't I open it up for questions, and then I can talk more if there aren't questions. And offer some thoughts. questions or comments in the back?
You mentioned that a lot of Chilean capital was put into this at the very beginning. I was wondering if the Inter-American Development Bank or the World Bank or USAID, who also were interested in aquaculture, put anything into this.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one would suspect maybe they had. I don't know. The simple answer is I don't know the answer to the question, but it's a really good one. And although I don't recall seeing any mention of any sort of major, loans or things being provided, but what I do know is that one of the early aquaculture efforts, I think involved, I'm mixing up memories here. In other parts of southern Chile, there is definitely some history of, I think it was I always forget the name of the Japanese equivalent of AID, but I think they had initiated some other kinds of aquaculture operations in southern Chile, and it certainly would not surprise me if AID's links to the Fundación Chile would be interesting to look in too, and I don't actually know what they are, but I'll make a note of that because that would be a good question. Let's try another question a second.
All right, so this kind of monoculture is kind of doomed, either with bananas or fish. So what is your suggestion?
Okay, so I don't know if I've ever heard this good question. So let me see. The question was, this kind of monoculture is doomed. So what's the? You said what's the suggestion? Yeah, that gets into one of my points. Let me say this because I think this is an important clarification, and it gets right to this sustainability question. So we say, yeah, monoculture is doomed. Well, what about those export banana plantations that I write about that were around since the 1890s in Honduras? A lot of those farms are no longer there, but they're no longer there for a whole lot of different reasons, some of which are economic. Some of them have literally been paved for urban expansion, for a maquiladora industry, a light industry, assembly plants. And there are still some bananas that are grown and exported from Honduras, well over 100 years. I would say, sure, that's sustainable to me. I mean, how long are we really hoping for here? So by that measure, I would say, I'd urge caution. Say it's not necessarily doomed. Here's how I'd qualify that, what I would say, and what's happened with the banana industry. The banana industry, though, does have to largely abandon much of Honduras, much of the Atlantic coast of Central America. They move to the Pacific side. They go to Ecuador, where they still are today. Now, they've been in Ecuador for well over about 60 years now, really producing a lot in Ecuador. So again, that's a pretty long time for, again, it depends on how we're measuring sustainability. That's why I throw it out as a question. But if we talk about local, this is why I think scale becomes so important for questions. Here's my sort of message on this. Scale, geographical scale, temporal scale are hugely important to trying to define sustainability. Because I think if you're talking about a little community in Chiloé, a particular community, yeah, it's probably safe to say the salmon industry, in a sense, it's doomed. It's not going to provide stable livelihoods or stable, let's just say stable livelihoods. It's going to move. So my initial prediction, based on the laws, that the way the Chilean government's responded to this crisis, the way the industry has responded, is that they're going to disperse. And this is, again, pretty much what the banana industry did. They're going to disperse geographically. Both sort of, again, it's sort of like a mid-scale, so the farms will literally be dispersed. But I also suspect they're going to move further south toward Tierra del Fuego and the province known as Magallanes, which is the far south of Chile, where there's no native salmon. They've introduced other species of fish. So in that sense, I suspect the salmon industry will come back in Chile. My prediction would be, yeah, it's going to come back because the economic, the investment is great, the political interest is there, and I suspect it will, in fact, happen within maybe 2 or 3, 5 years. I think we'll see Chilean salmon again. But again, I would argue this. Again, this question of sustainability is a little more complicated. If we're talking about creating sustainable livelihoods, equitable livelihoods at a local level, then yeah, I think it's doomed. It is not, to me, a model that will work in my mind. I would say that's what I would argue by historical, based on the historical evidence I've seen. More practically, and then I'll go take another question, and I talked to one Chilean biologist who actually looks at the cultivation of seaweeds, basically, plants. In fact, he had gone to Long Island. Because I don't want to say aquaculture is evil or something like that. Let's talk about other applications of the technology. He had recently been in Rhode Island when I met with him, I think in November, a project to try to restore the Long Island Sound. And one of the things they're trying to do is bioremediation and figuring out, well, can we cultivate certain kinds of aquatic plants to help that process? I asked him, well, what about polycultures? Is it beyond the imagination that you could have an aquaculture system where you're not just raising a monoculture? And he said at this point, nobody's thinking about, which is, again, why I come back to the point about what I think is about profits, about expecting a certain level of profits, about expecting a certain consistency of profits. And I'm using profits right here, and again, I'm hoping that we can open this up for discussion, as opposed to maybe using the C word, capitalism, just because I'm not really afraid to use capitalism, but I find it to be a word that can mean so many things. I want to be a little more precise, and in some ways, frankly, a little more realistic. I don't know, to me, ending capitalism, again, it seems like it means so many things to different people. I don't know what that would mean. I don't know if I would be happy. But I certainly think we need to limit profits. I don't think limiting profits would radically alter a lot of people's lives in a practical sense. I don't think there's anything constitutionally, to prevent these things from happening. And yet, of course, it's with sustainability. My point here is how you do that, of course, is complex, and maybe it's a pipe dream. But my main point is when people talk about sustainability, and I guess I'm saying people here, I'm mostly talking about biologists and economists, although I think some historians too, or just policy people, they don't tend to talk about this profit issue. They don't tend to talk about this. They talk about, growing human populations, things like that, but not so much this issue of profits. And I think if that's not at least on the table as something that can be modified, I would say yes, this is kind of a doomed development model. Doomed in the sense of it's going to create unstable livelihoods in things where companies, if they're going to make profits, they're going to do it by what they've done in agriculture for a long time. When you need a lot of workers, you hire them. When you don't need them, they're expendable. But the point is, it's very hard to accumulate, right? That's why I say, really think about it as accumulation, because you can imagine a government doing the same thing. So I'm using profits, but if we're really thinking about, in some ways, when I'm really trying to think about this project, think through, is a reason to bring back a very old question, but now maybe it's for slightly different things at stake, slightly different frameworks, and thinking about accumulation. I mean, I was inspired by an article by William Boyd, the guy who wrote the book about, knock on wood, about trees in the Pacific Northwest, Scott Prudhomme and somebody else, who borrow on ideas of Polanyi about fictitious commodities. Sorry if I'm making references that are now losing people. But and they talk about the problem of industrialization, industrial dynamics, and the problem of nature, which is a very interesting article, and the basis of that is talking about the way nature creates sort of surprises, obstacles for extractive industries, and what tends to compel forest companies to start planting trees, what compels fish industries to start doing aquaculture, things like that trying to explain that pattern. Also talking about the way, though, that surprises create obstacles, but then maybe create opportunities, for companies to come in and, say, start to patent genetic modifications, right, that maybe deal with a particular problem over a short-term basis. What I'm interested in is, I think this all is good stuff, but I'm interested in turning that around and say, why the problem of nature? It seems to me nature, in a sense, is not the problem. It becomes a problem when you're trying to accumulate. And so I think it's that accumulation of capital, accumulation of resources, that's what I want to suggest. We got to re-embed that notion in, put it back into social and ecological contexts, and then see what questions we can ask, and see what models might become viable if we're really radically rethinking, not as nature being an obstacle or a problem, but actually the challenge that's always been for people is to accumulate, I would argue.
2 points. One, how do these conditions compare with those that you had mentioned in Norway and in the North Atlantic? And second, you read a lot about Whole Foods saying that our salmon is raised in a ecologically friendly way. What is your view of that?
Yeah, no, again, thank you. That's an excellent question. And to pick another, to say why this also might not be doomed. I don't want to suggest, again, it's sort of an all or nothing. And certainly if you talk to a lot of the people there right now, as you can imagine, who had been employed by this industry, I'm sure they would love to see this come back. Certainly in Norway, the companies don't even dispute. They raise fish under different regulation, arguably more regulations. They do have some different production processes, some of which are starting to be incorporated into Chile as much for economic reasons as any kind of imposed regulation, so to speak. And so some of these things are going to probably start happening, which is another reason why I think the industry will come back. It will be under probably profit margins will in fact be smaller. Probably they'll be reduced. There'll probably be greater costs of production if the government in fact is serious about increasing regulations. Now in Scotland, I think Whole Foods, and I've seen Scotland certainly promotes that their fish farming is more sustainable. And I'm just going to be honest, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't really done research on it. Don't know what the long-term implications are. Don't know what's happening with natives, issues of biodiversity in Scotland. I do know, apparently they use fewer, what I think is pretty much conclusive, is for sure, is in both Norway and Scotland they use fewer antibiotics than at least they were using in Chile. I think the basic questions though of food, feed, I don't believe that's demonstrably different, from what they'd be doing in Chile in terms of feeding the salmon. So I think there's some issues that presumably are going to be universal, if you will, for the universe of Atlantic salmon farming. A good question, though. I mean, excuse me.
I relate comparison to bananas, and it makes sense. But I was thinking of a different comparison, and I wonder if you would like to expand on that. I mean, cattle. This is pens, antibiotics. People eat salmon instead of cattle because it's better for the environment. And I don't know. Could you expand on that comparison?
Yeah, I would love to be able to. And actually, I have some, as I mentioned before, there's some people in Colombia who could do this much better than I could, but who are doing a lot of research on questions of meat and consumption in Latin American cattle, because the question is about cattle production. And I think, yeah, no, I understand. No, I understand what you're saying. And I think that I said I could do it better because I don't necessarily have the cattle industry on the top of my tongue, but what I would say, and let me say this, part of the reason why I picked bananas is because it seems like it's such a what's the word? It's not very intuitive that there's going to be these similar dynamics, and that's what I really want to focus on is the dynamics. But yes, I think actually the cattle industry, which is why, in fact, in the longer version of the paper, and I was drawn to sort of comparing, say, what goes on in the cattle industry, both in terms of this idea of taking what, in a sense, well, and actually you might be able to argue, yeah, I suppose in Argentina, in particular in the Pampas, where arguably the cattle were more free-ranging, let's say, at once upon a time anyway, although obviously still managed. And then, development of railroads, developing packing plants, transportation, refrigeration, diseases, certainly an issue both in terms of, human things that might affect human health as well as animal health. I'm actually going to look at, maybe this will, all right, I'm going to cheat here and use this as a way to work backwards into my project. The other part of this research that I've actually done a lot more of than I've done with the salmon industry in terms of archival research is looking at the sheep industry, which was in southern Argentina and Chile in Tierra del Fuego beginning around 1900. And yes, I mean, that's part of, this is what I'm envisioning sort of being the more contemporary part of this project, and what I'm hoping is to do exactly some comparisons with what's going on with sheep and these kinds of dynamics and salmon. And certainly there are some very similar issues, whether you're talking about the relationship of the sheep and their ability to transform their immediate environment, their interaction with other potential predators, questions of bioseguridad, questions of sanitation is certainly an issue. Sarna, classic diseases of sheep, that has to be controlled. I found some interesting examples of pollution resolving, or sort of environmental, what we might call environmental justice kind of, or environmental conflict over pollution, over the contamination of water, in the process of cleaning, disinfecting sheep, that type of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what I want to kind of explore, and I haven't, frankly, not at the stage yet where I've sort of pulled it all together, but that's the idea. That's the idea. Ted?
I still don't have clear in my mind what's the largest significance of what you're doing here. And maybe that's because we never really got to conclusions.
Right. Well, say more, a little more in terms of, well.
I think
Okay.
the part that's still unclear to me is the nature culture business. I think the way I look at it, at least, this is an interesting case study that has something to say about sustainability as a concept, not much of a concept, but as a political concept, and its relationship with neoliberalism or whatever conceptualization you want for what's going on economically, structurally, since 1980. So that's sort of one, to me, discrete and I think interesting, very interesting scholarly intervention. And at the beginning, what surprised me a little was this business about nature and culture, and that frankly, that didn't impress me. I mean, that's kind of very broad, and I didn't really see what's the relationship there between this nature culture and what you're really doing in terms of on the ground with this project.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the criticism because I agree, and it's funny because I had the same kind of reaction to a paper I just heard at ASEH, and I guess I'm sort of still in dialogue with the person who gave another paper, and I haven't really fleshed this out. What I'm trying to, let me just I don't know if I can actually give you, okay, let me just try to articulate this and maybe you won't be impressed. But I guess my concern is, and what I'm trying to do, think through via this project, and I may not have actually done it with this part of this project today, I agree, I don't think I have, is I'm still concerned, or at least me, partly as a writer, partly as a thinker, we've sort of got these two, the metaphor seems to be you've got nature and culture, or whatever you want to call these things, biology, social, and it's about putting them together, right? About integrating. Would you accept that? Some notion of maybe not. Okay, maybe you don't accept that, but I would argue, if you look at a lot of books in environmental history, the introduction, that's what I would say they're basically implying. Maybe not in your books, but at least a lot of the ones I've seen. So my argument is then, I think that's an important notion, but I guess what I'm trying to think about how to write is to not get people thinking, well, there's still some essential nature and there's still some essential social or culture that then sort of gets mixed, almost, well, yeah, I won't, okay, let me just leave it at that. So what rather try to write about, so it's more about process, and it's precise that again, this thing, I'm still actually looking for words to articulate this. I think it's precisely the mixing that is, the essentiality is the dynamic, which sounds like it's kind of silly, and probably isn't going to impress you either, but I think it's, and that's what I'm trying to sort of think through and try to convey, not maybe so much in this example, frankly, but in the larger sort of project. And again, it's probably not going to satisfy you, but that's what I'm trying to work with. But if you don't see a fundamental problem with this initial thing, then you're not going to find it. I just find it.
It's just that I think you have an interesting, something very interesting to say about the politics of sustainability. And it just seems like it fits very well with the evidentiary base, just based on what I heard here for 35, 40 minutes.
Right.
The other, the nature culture business, frankly, that seems a little out there for, for this. I mean,
Fair enough. Well, that's, all right, let me just sort of, yeah, I actually would agree with you. And so and it was sort of prompted by maybe just a frustration of, maybe I'm just reading too much environmental history, I need to read something else for a while. But no, quite seriously, what I presented, and actually the way it's going to be framed, the article version of this, that hopefully will get it accepted, is really focusing more on this problem of accumulation. It's trying to link up this other thing. I actually don't really go into this nature culture thing. That's something that really is I agree, it is out there right now. And that's when I talk about this longer project that still needs research, it's going to look at, I'm going to try to look at 3 commodities. So look at seal, and different, what I'd argue seem to be qualitatively different. Fur seal hunting in the late 18th, 19th century, all in this more or less the same general region. The shift from fur seal hunting, commodifying fur seals, to the agropastoral introduction of sheep. And then the later stage, I'm actually thinking about pursuing 2 different directions. One may be looking at development of tourism, conservation areas first, creation of conservation areas. And why that, again, it might seem like a leap. Perhaps it is. Partly trying to think about, I'm trying to keep actually animals as a constant here. So I'll back up a second. So animals are in the big project. So you've got seals, you've got hunting seals, raising sheep. And then the last part originally I was thinking of revalorizing native fauna to, whatever, take pictures of it, to have, whatever you want to think, whatever tourists are doing. And actually that's something I want to try to investigate. What our tourists think they're doing when they come to these places. But also there's some direct ties. In other words, the people who own sheep farms were some of the big people who accumulated a lot of capital from that, built some of the first hotels, were some of the first people to start to promote parks. So there's some real, in other words, the historical actors are sometimes one and the same in that story. The salmon thing came about literally as I was in the doing archival stuff, and the things were so compelling that then I started thinking, well, how could I fit sort of salmon in, and wouldn't it be interesting to think about, the ways that, again, thinking about the relationship from sheep and going from seals to sheep and then back to salmon, I think is sort of just potentially interesting. But there's still a lot to be worked out to sort of bring that all together into a coherent story, to say the least. But it really, in some ways, originally conceptualized about being about animals, a study of human-animal relationships. And then beyond that, and actually I'll make a pitch for a friend, and Ed, I'm going to hope to build on the work of a guy by the name of Ed Russell, who teaches at the University of Virginia, who's got, I think, 2 forthcoming books coming out. One's about dogs, and then the other one is, I think, an edited volume that looks a lot at these questions of sort of biology, what he calls evolutionary history, I think he calls it, and looking at a lot of these questions of sort of biological change. Because I'm also interested in I'm increasingly interested in issues of reproduction and what's going on with that commodification is not just about producing things. Again, it's somewhat obvious, I think, but really central to that is reproduction of the animals, both getting them to reproduce and then, of course, also somewhat counterintuitively getting them to not reproduce on their own. And so, which I think is also something interesting that maybe merits further exploration, thinking about the implications of that for a whole host of things.
Question?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. In your parallels to bananas, I was struck by something you didn't mention that you discussed in the book, which is consumption, which seems like the flip side of accumulation. If you're going to make an argument that focuses on accumulation, I mean, this slide here points to this fundamental problem with booms in any particular commodity crop or animal species. There are huge numbers, great diversity of edible species, and yet the trend over the course of the 20th century has been to kind of winnow this down to a handful of mass-produced varieties, whether we're talking about chickens, to cattle varieties, sheep varieties, and certainly true of fish, like salmon and tuna, and not this whole spectrum of other fish.
Right.
What's the consumption side of the story in terms of the cultivation of taste? Is it a nutrition story? Is it a I don't know. What are the dimensions of consumption
Right.
in this story?
That, well, yeah, and I mean, you're right. So you need to say, I certainly think that's a huge part of the story. And again, it's just a part that I haven't, frankly, gotten to yet. And it would probably be turning this into a book and not an article. Although, just sort of, I've been thinking about, I think the health issue. I mean, again, I'm not also happy. It's another, I'll do this discussion offline, but I'm not really happy with the consumption literature too. I mean, I think there's been some interesting work recently that's kind of pointing out some of the problems, but theorizing consumption, I think, is actually not as well understood as maybe some people like to think it is. Having said that, I do think there's, in terms of the United States context, and Japan may be quite different, I do think the health issue partly explains it. But if you want to take more of a sort of I mean, there's also the role of Walmart. Some people have written about this, the role of Walmart and, say, Costco in creating a huge market for this, right? Because they start to sell salmon, at very, very cheap prices, and so they become a huge buyer of this. And not only that, but like what I did experience or get some feel for, and again, I apologize for jumping around, but this is fragmentary right now. On the Japanese side, what I know is going on is that they've got the companies that are buying fish, let's say smoked coho salmon, that's still being produced. They'll have a person in, say, Portemont who periodically drives to these processing plants and will say, okay, I actually don't know how far in advance, but let's say, 4 months from now, whatever, 5 months from now, we want salmon this size, this amount, smoked in this way. And so to think about what I'm saying about bananas, as I caution, and I would still expect to see this in salmon, sure, there's thinking about what the end consumers, me eating more salmon and less red meat, we can think about why I'm doing that or think I'm doing that as an individual consumer. But there's a whole host of other actors that are probably far more important, namely the people who are buying for Costco and Walmart and for the Japanese counterparts who are apparently literally kind of dictating, or as buyers, saying this is what we want. And again, that's partly the attraction, I think, of farming salmon. And this question, I sort of also got away from something I alluded to early on about creating the standardization and uniformity of the product. Because, fish, right, they're going to be all different sizes. Open fish hatcheries, they're sort of going to be various sizes, various sizes, particularly in weights and things. So under fish farming, you can do a lot to at least eliminate that kind of variability by controlling the feed, eliminating predators and that kind of thing. So I don't know if that exactly answers it, just kind of points. I haven't really, again, this is still somewhat in development kind of project. So, and also to be totally frank, I also know there is a graduate student, frankly, who's working on this, and I'm trying not to. I'm actually not sure how I'm going to take this project because I don't want to sort of step on the turf, and so I'm going to see where he's going with this. But that's certainly one angle that if I were going to do more research on this, or somebody else was, I'd definitely say you must look at this consumption side. And some people have looked at the global. I could give you some citations to people who looked at the global commodity chain of this and talk about the role of Walmart and that kind of thing in salmon. Yeah. One more? Okay.
Because I know we're getting to sort of what I think of the magic out of the mind family, the magic
Okay, yes, yes,
One
yes.
thing almost sounds like you're going from a farming economy to a manufacturing economy where you are manufacturing fish. I'll order 50,000 salmons 12 inches long, 4.5 pounds, produce that. And they'll go around and shop, and if you can't produce or someone else has a lower price, the market is really, you're out of business.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, well, yeah, I think presumably that's sort of the dynamic that's played out. And right now, I mean, in terms of, I believe, sourcing salmon, I think Canada is supplying a lot more of the salmon now to the U.S. market, given the fact that, some of this Chilean supply has basically come to a halt. And there are political things, like in terms of where fish is being sourced. There's a point that the U.S. changed their trade policies with Norway, making it harder for Norwegian salmon to enter the market, easier favoring Chilean salmon. So I mean, there's a lot of political dimensions to markets, as well as these kinds of things, more of this kind of industrialization of taste.
With a company like Walmart, you don't walk in there and say, "I'll sell you light bulbs for $1." Walmart will tell you, "I'll pay you 75 cents for your light bulbs. You want a deal, yes or no?" And some of these, like maybe the Japanese and other people, says,
Yeah.
"Here, you want to deal with me? Here are the conditions. Here's your price."
Yeah, no, exactly.
Not
And
dictating
the
price.
salmon and I think the fresh food industry and fresh food, I actually also elaborate a little more on. I try to be even a little more specific. I think the fresh food industry in particular, or food that what we call the fresh food, is also some peculiarities that again make reason why meat. I think meat would still apply to things like the livestock industry, bananas and salmon. Actually it does have to do not just how they're produced, but actually I think how they're consumed, the implications for transportation and all that stuff, who's controlling the marketing. I think I'll partly explain why you see similar dynamics that you might not see with coffee, let's say. Actually, I think coffee actually is a little bit different, in part because that can be stored and has slightly some different, fresh per se is not the main thing there with coffee. All right, everybody, thank you very much for your questions and your patience. I really appreciate it.
Showing how complex